So, what about the standardization of one text of the Qur'an? Why did Allah require that? And so it was in stone in heaven. Consequently, during the reign of Uthman, the third Caliph, a deliberate attempt was made to standardize the Qur'an and impose a single text upon the whole Muslim community. The codex of Zaid ibn Thabit, taken from the manuscript of Hafsah, was chosen by Uthman for this purpose, to the consternation of both Mas'ud and Ibn Ka'b. Zaid ibn Thabit was a much younger man, who had not yet been born at the time Mas'ud had recited 70 suras by heart before Muhammad. According to Muslim tradition, Zaid's codice was chosen by Uthman because the language used, the Quraishi dialect, was local to Mecca, and so had become the standard Arabic. Tradition maintains that Zaid, along with 3 scholars of the Quraishi tribe of Mecca, had written the codice in this Quraishi dialect as it had been revealed to Muhammad in this dialect. Linguists today, however, are still at a quandary to know what exactly this Quraishi dialect was, as it doesn't exist today and therefore cannot be identified. Wow! Furthermore, the dialect which we find in the present Qur'an does not differ from the language which was current in other parts of the Hijaz at that time. While it makes for a good theory, it has little historical evidence with which to back it up. A further reason for the choice of Zaid's codice, according to tradition, was that it had been kept in virtual seclusion for many years, and so had not attracted the publicity as one of the varying texts, as had the codices of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and ibn Ka'b. Hope I'm pronouncing these words right, these names. Ironically, by virtue of their popularity, Mas'ud's and Ka'b's codices were rejected as sources for the final Qur'an and supplanted by the codice of an individual who neither had the notoriety nor the experience, and whose text, as we shall soon discover, had never been selected as authoritative by the Prophet as had the other 2. Consequently, copies of Zaid's codice were then sent out and dispersed throughout every Muslim province, while all the other manuscripts were summarily destroyed. So much for authentication. Burn it. It is evident from this discussion that the final choice for an authoritative text had little to do with its authenticity, but had more to do with the fact that it was not a controversial manuscript. It is also evident that there were no 2 Qur'ans which existed at the time which were exactly alike. This tradition tells us that other whole copies did exist, yet not one of the other texts were spared the order for their destruction. We must conclude that the destruction of the other manuscripts was a drastic effort to standardize the Quranic text. While we may have one standard text today, there is no proof that it corresponds with the original. We can only say that it may possibly be similar to the Uthmanic recension, which was one of many of them. Yet, what evidence is there that in all instances it was the correct one? We don't know, as we have no others with which to compare. And we have the Septuagint compared to the original Hebrew text, Masoretic text rather, which was a compilation in a new vocabulary alphabet of the ancient text that was gathered in the 10th century. And then we have the Septuagint version, and we have also the Samaritan version, and the many translations in other languages, and quotations in letters, and so on. All this compilation, tens of thousands of documents, we know where the original text is, almost down to the letter. This then brings up, that's the Bible, this then brings up the missing verses, up another difficult problem. How can we be sure that what Zaid ibn Thabit included in his codice or manuscript contained the full revelation of Muhammad's revelation? The fact is, we simply cannot. We are forced to rely on Muslim tradition to tell us, which Muslim tradition is not substantive, it constantly changes. Yet, interestingly, it is Muslim tradition which informs us that Zaid himself initially cast doubt on his own codice. G4I, Surah 33:23. According to Sahih Bukhari, volume 6, page 79, despite the fact that Zaid's text had been copied out and sent to the 7 different cities, Zaid suddenly remembered that a verse which the Prophet had quoted earlier was missing from the text. Wow. Zaid is quoted as saying that this missing verse was verse 23 of Surah 33, which says, "Among the believers are men who have been true in their covenant with Allah." So he searched for the verse until he found it with Uthman ibn al-Ansari. Thus we find that after the copies had been sent out claiming to be the only authentic and complete copies of the Qur'an available, Zaid and he alone recorded a verse which was missing, a verse which, once again, was only found with one man. This resembles the previous occasion where a verse was only found with one man. The conclusion is obvious. Initially, all of those 7 copies which were sent out to the provinces were imperfect. But even more concerning is the fact that it was due to the recollection of one man and the memory of another that the Qur'an was finally completed. Once again, it is obvious that there simply could not have been any man at that time who knew the whole Qur'an by heart. This is yet another instance which contradicts the argument posed by Muslims that the Qur'an had been memorized by certain men during the early days of Islam. Almost, maybe now, more than 1 billion people swear by the Qur'an. Yet look at this history. But of more importance is the troubling question of whether there were perhaps other verses which were overlooked or were left out. The answer to this question can be found in another of the authoritative traditions, that of Sahih Muslim. There's a verse on stoning. Muslim maintains that key passages were missing from Zaid's text. The most famous is the verse of stoning. All the major traditions speak of this missing verse. According to Ibn Ishaq's version, page 684, we read, God sent Muhammad and sent down the scripture to him. Part of what he sent down was the passage on stoning. Umar says, we read it, we were taught it, and we heeded it. The apostle Muhammad stoned, and we stoned after him. I fear that in the time to come men will say that they find no mention of stoning in God's book, and thereby go astray in neglecting an ordinance which God has sent down. Verily, stoning in the book of God is a penalty laid on married men and women who commit adultery. Therefore, according to Umar, the stoning verse was part of the original Qur'an, the revelation which Allah sent down, but now it is missing. In many of the traditions, we find numerous reports of adulterous men and women who were stoned by the Prophet and his companions. Yet today, we read in the Qur'an, Surah 24:32, that the penalty for adultery is 100 lashes. Umar said adultery was not only a capital offense, but one which demanded stoning. That verse is now missing from the Qur'an, and that is why Umar raised this issue. Muslims will need to ask themselves whether indeed their Qur'an can claim to be the same as that passed down by Muhammad to his companions. With evidence such as this, the Qur'an in our possession today becomes all the more suspect. G5. Yet that is not all. Wow, there's more? Another glaring problem with Zaid's text is that it differed from the other codices which coexisted with his. Arthur Jeffrey has done this classic work on the variants of the early codices in his book, Materials for the History of the Text of the Qur'an, printed in 1937. You'll probably get that in a library somewhere. The 3 main codices which he lists are those which we have referred to earlier and include Ibn Mas'ud, Abdul Allah b. Mas'ud, died 653, from Kufa in Iraq. It is he who is reported to have learned 70 suras directly from Muhammad and was appointed by Muhammad as one of the first teachers of Quranic recitation, according to Ibn Sa'id. Mas'ud became a leading authority on the Quran and Hadith in Kufa, Iraq. He refused to destroy his copy of the Quran or stop teaching it when the Uthmanic recension was made official. 2. Ubay ibn Ka'b died 649, a Medinian Muslim who was associated with Damascus, Syria. Prior to that, he was a secretary for the Prophet and was considered by some to be more prominent than Mas'ud in Quranic understanding during the Prophet's lifetime. Ubay's codice had 2 extra suras. He destroyed his codice after the Uthmanic recension. 3. Abu Musa died 662, a Yemenite. Though his codice was accepted in Basra, where he served as governor under Umar, nevertheless, his codex was large, and it contained the 2 extra suras of Ubay's codex, and other verses not found in other codices. Jeffrey, pages 209 and 211. In addition to these 3, Jeffrey classifies 12 other codices belonging to the companions of the Prophet, which were considered as primary. One of these, Ali bin Abi Talib, a cousin and a son-in-law of Muhammad, is said to have been the first to collect the Quran after the Prophet's death and to have arranged the suras in some sort of chronological order. According to Jeffrey, there were thousands of variations between the different codices. These are different references of writers. Jeffrey is an author on this issue. G5I. Take, for instance, Allah Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's codex. Take, for instance, the codex of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, a very close companion of the Prophet. According to the traditions, as we know it, he was refused to hand over his manuscript after the order went out from Uthman for all existing copies to be burned. I thought they'd be burned. There is much evidence today to show that, in fact, his text is far more reliable than Hafsah's manuscript, which we know to be the one collated by Zaid ibn Thabit. Ibn Mas'ud alone was present with Muhammad when he reviewed the content of the Quran every year during the month of Ramadan. In the well-known collection of traditions of Ibn, we read these words. Ibn Abbas asked, "Which of the 2 readings of the Quran do you prefer?" The Prophet answered, "The reading of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Verily, the Quran was recited before the Apostle of Allah once in every Ramadan, except the last year when it was recited twice. The Abdullah ibn Mas'ud came to him, and he learned what was altered and abrogated. Thus no one knew the Quran better than he did." In the same tradition by Ibn Sa'id, volume 2, page 442, it says, "No surah was revealed, but I, Mas'ud, knew about it and what was revealed. If I had known anyone knowing more of the book of Allah than me, I would have gone to him." Ibn Mas'ud lays claim here to be the foremost authority of the text of the Quran. In fact, it is Sahih Muslim who informs us that Mas'ud knew 70 surahs by heart and was considered to have a better understanding of the Quran than the other companions of the Prophet. He recited these 70 passages before the Prophet and the companions, and no one disputed with him. In Sahih Bukhari, we read that Muhammad himself singled out Abdullah ibn Mas'ud as the first and foremost authority on the Quran. According to Ibn Sa'id, Mas'ud learned his 70 surahs while Zaid was still a youth. Thus his authority should have been greater, as he knew so much of the Quran long before Zaid became a man. Arthur Jeffrey, in his book, points out that several thousand variants taken from over 30 main sources. Of special note are those which he found between the codex of Ibn Mas'ud and that of Zaid ibn Thabit. He also found that Mas'ud codex agreed with the other codices which existed at the expense of Zaid's text. While we don't have the time to go into all the variations, it might be helpful if you could obtain a copy of Arthur Jeffrey's book, Materials for the History of the Text of the Quran. Arthur Jeffrey. We've gone into enough here, I'm convinced. According to Jeffrey, Abu Mas'ud's codex was different from the Uthmanic text in several different ways.